Appian provides an easy, visual way for you to query data from a relational database. Using the query editor, you can configure the properties of your query, including paging and sorting information, filters, and columns of data to return. When you create a query using the query editor, it's saved as an expression rule. You can call the rule to return query results that can be used in a process model or as part of an interface, like a form, a record, or a report. You can learn more about expression rules in our course Expressions, Transform Your Data, but we'll show you briefly how you can access the query editor by creating a new expression rule. From the new menu in Designer, select Expression. The name of the expression should follow best practices, which means that it should include an application prefix, followed by an underscore, and then Pascal casing for the name of the rule. That's where you uppercase each letter of distinct elements of the rule name. In this example, we're going to return product data, so the rule name is OSM_getAllProducts. Make sure to provide a description, and for easy searching, save it to an expression rules folder, a subfolder of the parent rules and constants folder. You might even create a queries folder within your expressions folder for more granular organization. Before you define the query, you first need to tell Appian where to go to get the data. In other words, we need to point the query to a specific data store entity that's associated to a table or a view in our database. We can reference the data store entity through a constant. In our case, we created a constant for this purpose in our previous lesson, so we'll call it here. Once the query editor knows where to look for the data, you can start to define the parameters of the query, including paging and sorting, filters, and the columns of data you want to return. Paging determines the number of rows to return in a query. You can either return all of the rows of data, or you can define a certain number of rows to return. The paging threshold will determine the number of rows that display per page on a paging grid. You can use the expression option if the number of rows returned should be dynamic, based on a value provided by a process or by a user. For example, you might choose to let a user determine the number of rows to display at a time on a paging grid. Sorting determines the order in which the data will be returned, based on one of the columns of data from the data source. You can use filters to ensure that you're only viewing select rows of data from the results of your query. These are default filters. We can also create user filters. These allow users to filter through the results of the query after they're displayed on an interface. Let's take a look at an example of each. First, we can create a default filter to ensure that the query results only retrieve data for products that are available for order. The field we're filtering on is active, and this is a Boolean. The value of the filter condition we're looking for is true. In our example, we can create a user filter to enable users to filter through the results set using the name of the product. To configure this example, you first need to create a rule input, since the data we're filtering on will come from a user. The rule input allows us to map the user search criteria from the interface to the filter. Then, once you add a new filter, you need to pick the field you're filtering on and choose either starts with or includes as your operator. You can select the rule input from the dropdown. When you build the interface, you can create a local variable to capture the user's search value and pass it into the rule input of the query. By default, the filter will be ignored until a user provides data for it. The Apply Filter option enables you to only apply the filter under certain conditions. For example, you might want most employees to see a subset of data from the query, but meanwhile, managers should be able to see all of the data. We can use the logged in user function to see who's viewing the data and determine whether or not to apply the filter. Lastly, you can choose which columns of data to display. For performance reasons, it helps to only select the columns of data you need to return. You can run the query to preview the data at any time. Before you generate the query for saving, notice there's an option to fetch total row count. This property is used for calculating the number of pages in a paging grid. If you're going to use the results of your query for some other reason, then this data is likely unnecessary, and you should uncheck the box to help improve query performance. When you generate the query, it automatically creates an expression. Make sure to save the expression in order to call the rule from within other design objects, like a process model or an interface.